on debate. Senator Wallin.
Thank you, Speaker. Colleagues, I ask for your indulgence, as I know many of you have heard me speak to this issue of advance requests on repeated occasions over the last decade. But we have many new colleagues, so for the record, let me touch on a few points. An advance request is an agreement usually written to seek medical assistance in dying, even though your death is not imminent, or in the event that you lose the capacity to consent in your final days. I was grateful when the Senate approved and passed an amendment calling for advance requests, and was in turn profoundly disappointed when the government of the day rejected our well-considered advice from this place, endorsed by senators from all sides of this chamber. I'm reintroducing this bill in its existing form for the sake of time and because committees have done some work on this over the last 10 years. But I am adding this time round a preamble recognizing the new law enacted by the province of Quebec, which I hope will serve as guidance. On the advice of our law clerks, this preamble will allow the committee to reference the new law in their study of and amendments to this bill. And to be clear, I am seeking and open to amendments because there have been many important legal developments in Canada. The preamble says in part that the Quebec law will allow for persons suffering from a serious and incurable illness leading to incapacity to give consent to care, to make an advance request for medical aid in dying. Then my bill will go on to say, and I will summarize, we would amend the criminal code to permit an individual whose death is not reasonably foreseeable to enter into a written agreement to receive medical assistance in dying on a specified day if they lose the capacity to consent to receiving medical assistance in dying prior to that day. And B, to permit an individual who has been diagnosed with a serious and incurable disease, illness, or disability to make a written declaration to waive the requirement for final consent when receiving medical assistance in dying if they lose the capacity to consent to receive medical assistance and are suffering from symptoms outlined in the written declaration and have met all other relevant safeguards outlined in the criminal code. Death and dying are part of life. For better or worse, we are the only species that is actually aware of the inevitability of our own death. This motivates us, helps us find purpose. It makes moments meaningful and precious. If we are both lucky and willing, such awareness will also ready us for a dignified end to our own life and help us face that loss gracefully and with compassion. We also live in a time where we can reasonably foresee death. We can diagnose terminal illnesses. We can spot the signs of physical or cognitive decline scientifically and with great accuracy. But in the pursuit of longevity, we must also and always consider the quality of life. I believe it is our right and responsibility to be able to make our own end-of-life decisions. It is our burden, our bodies, but our choice. I've come to my views watching both of my parents die in two very different but equally tragic ways. My father to painful cancers, my mother to Alzheimer's. Their suffering was unnecessary and preventable. A graceful exit was the only kindness they asked for, to be spared pain and indignity. My father had no access to MAiD living in a rural area in Saskatchewan. For my mother, it was not possible under the law to even ask. These are difficult issues for families. I was lucky enough to grow up in a home where pragmatic, honest conversation happened at the supper table most nights of the week. So when my father needed complicated open-heart surgery and an aortic transplant, he received wonderful care, survived the long surgery, and lived another decade in relative health before the cancers took hold. What struck me was the ease with which the hospital and my father talked about the DNR, the Do Not Resuscitate order that must be signed before surgery. My dad couldn't have been clearer. If I can't walk, talk, hunt, or think, then there's no point. He was all about quality of life, not quantity. As a society, we accept the DNRs and living wills for the comfort they offer. If you are undergoing life-threatening surgery or want to state your wishes that in case of an accident, you don't want the extraordinary measures employed just to keep you alive in a vegetative state, then this is what they're there for. For me, an advanced request is simply part of that continuum. Allow me to offer a little bit more context. When the government introduced Bill C-14, an act to amend the Criminal Code, in 2016 in response to a Supreme Court ruling in the Carter case, it was about affording individuals the right to make their own end-of-life decisions. The government put in place, as we did in this chamber, a series of safeguards to guard against a slippery slope of access and to give more time for experts to reflect on the ethical complexity of these issues. The concern was that an assisted death ought not replace essential support and services for the underrepresented, the unwilling, or those who could not be treated or cared for because they were failed by an unjust system. We cannot underestimate the importance of these concerns. I served on the Joint MAiD Committee for several years to study these very matters. MAiD is not an alternative to poverty or treatment or support or family. It should and must always be a choice. And to protect medical practitioners, safeguards were put in place to make sure those requesting to undergo MAiD must state, literally in the moment before their medically assisted death, that they remain certain in their wish to die. In the law, it's called the waiver of final consent. The thinking was that this would prevent misadministration, ensuring that the patient, their doctor, the family, loved ones could all be absolutely certain that a MAiD recipient actually was ready to die. But instead of making things easier, it actually ended up creating more ambiguity for patients. It created a kind of Kafkaesque scenario where people who were eligible to undergo a medically assisted death, but say had an advanced form of cancer that they knew would worsen, and the end actually prevent them from making that final consent out loud, well, then they would have no choice but to end their own life prematurely, to take their own life so much sooner than was needed, simply because they might not be physically able to consent in the late painful stages. This is exactly what happened with Audrey Parker, a 57-year-old Nova Scotian woman with stage 4 breast cancer, who had to end her life 2 months before Christmas due to this rather poorly conceived safeguard in the law. Countless others have made similar decisions. We know their stories before the law was finally changed. So thanks to Audrey's voice and the work of her family, the government finally included what we now call Audrey's amendment to the law. It was an important step as it offered an early form of advanced request, but again, only for those who had already been assessed and approved for MAiD, and only when you were very close to the end of life. Then came along a key court decision in the Truchon and Gladue cases. Jean Truchon and Nicole Gladue launched a court challenge to seek MAiD, but had been denied because their death was not naturally foreseeable. Both had degenerative diseases causing persistent and intolerable suffering. Truchon with cerebral palsy and Gladue with the post-polio syndrome. In 2019, the Superior Court of Quebec agreed that the precondition was unconstitutional, and they called on Quebec and the federal government to respond. And this is very important because it removed the necessity of a reasonably foreseeable death, creating, in a sense, a two-track system for access to MAiD, one where death was imminent, and then a separate process where death was not foreseeable, inevitable, but not foreseeable. Colleagues, this was the context in which I had introduced an amendment to the law, later introduced this bill to fully allow for advance requests. My hope was to extend the right to an advance request to those whose death was not imminent, but inevitable, and to let Canadians have that choice, the right to a planned and peaceful end of life. Why would we not offer that choice to those trapped in a world of pain, or with a diagnosis of dementia, which robs you of your right to actually make end-of-life decisions? Boomers are turning 65 at a rate of 1,000 a day, and by 2031, 1,000 or more will turn 85 every day. That's a quarter of our population. Increases in life expectancy have been accompanied by more and more years of induced disability, age-induced disability. Modern medicine has given us longer life, but has also made us the victim of overtreatment, which too often offers quantity of life, but not quality of life. But where the issue of advance requests is so fundamental is for those experiencing cognitive decline, where they slowly and knowingly lose their grasp on reality and descend into what can only be described as the living death of dementia. 1 in 4 Canadians over the age of 85 suffers from dementia. For years, it was the law that once diagnosed, no longer were they able or considered to have the capacity to make decisions from that moment forward. We know it's not true, but it was the catch-22 in the law. Many people suffering from forms of dementia like Alzheimer's still cannot access MAiD because their deaths are not considered reasonably foreseeable. And this is why the timing issue is so important. And therefore, we must look at when and how often to update advance requests. So before we lose our capacity, let us make an informed choice about our future. It offers at least a little sense of control, when soon you will have none at all. When you lose your memory, you lose you. You lose your friends that you no longer know. You lose the family that you loved. And you lose the feeling of being loved. But most important of all, you lose that sense of self, who you truly once were, what you accomplished, the lives you touched, and you lose the love and respect once so freely offered. It's there, but you can't recognize it or see it. That was quite literally true of my mother. She was a school teacher. She changed lives. She saved lives. She was a role model before we even used that phrase. To watch her decline was heartbreaking. She stopped knowing what she had done for so many years and for so many others. The end of memory is brutal. It is a denial of our time as people who mattered and made a difference. It is a cruel and unusual punishment. There are those who will argue we can never really ever know what goes on in the mind of those with dementia or Alzheimer's. There may be moments of clarity or recognition, and we might think that if folks are happy and tapping their toes at the weekly music session, that then they do have a quality of life. Those in the old folks' homes call it happy dementia. But unfortunately, that is mostly about us wanting to feel better about our loved ones, because mere moments later, fear can once again engulf until that person simply knows no more. My mother could not articulate her wants and needs the way my father had on the eve of his surgery, and that is the inherent unfairness of one diagnosis versus another, that old catch-22. She, as we had discussed so often, never wanted a life without meaning or awareness of family and history, or an awareness of her past, of her own story. Families face this crisis every day in this country, every single day. Canadians with incurable or irreversible medical conditions suffer needlessly in hospital beds and care homes. Sadder still, they suffer sometimes with loved ones close at hand, but unrecognized. And so they suffer alone and in fear. And the worst of all fates, no longer knowing who they are or once were. So the time is now to be brave and to embrace the choices of those we love, to give them, if and only if they so choose, the right to leave us with dignity, just as they have lived and loved with dignity. So I ask you to consider this bill with both your head and your heart, and to send it to our colleagues on the committee to make it better and to do so in a timely manner. Thank you.